just wanna talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books. Talk about some, talk about some, talk about some books. Talk about some, talk about some, talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books with you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joe,
And I'm JoJo, and this is Canonical Nonsense.
and we are just two cups of Joe reading books.
Today on the pod, we're still discussing dragon books, and today's book is A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K, which is another early book in the history of dragon literature and the dragon canon.
Yeah, and we kind of already broke one of our rules that we established in the first podcast, which um, was that we weren't going to read books where the dragon was only in one scene, because the dragon is really only in one chapter in this book. But we didn't know that going into it, and it is considered an important part of the dragon canon. So we're just still going to talk about it because it was a pretty great scene, I think, personally.
There was dragons in two scenes, but one was more of a lizard. But once again, we will get to that.
Yeah, the character says it's not a real dragon, even though it looks like a dragon, which I think is a dragon. If it looks like a dragon, is it a dragon? I don't know.
Yeah,
I think so.
I mean, I think it's interesting to have a variety of a species, in the novel itself and acknowledge that. They also talk about dragons a bunch, so
Mhm. Yeah, dragons in this book are very different from the dragons in Pern, where they're less like an animal and more like this quasi godlike creature. So they are really important to the magic system and are brought up a lot when they're talking about the creation of the world. So even if they're not on screen, they still are really important to the way that Earthsea functions as a world, which is quite interesting. We have this very different take on dragons just so quickly. But anyway, we can jump into the plot now so that we can get to that dragon scene. So I do just want to say that this book was published in 1968. So it is really early on in the history of what we consider, our contemporary fantasy literature. They really started to pop up in the 60s and 70s, and it is very early on. And most of us probably have read a book by Ursula K. Le Guin, even if we haven't realized it, because she is a very prolific author and has written a ton of books that span a lot of different themes, a lot of different genres. So I want to start out by asking you, did you like this book?
oh, I love this book. I actually didn't read this book before. This is my first time reading it. I listened to it probably about 5 years ago, and I actually had a better time reading it for the second time than I thought I would, just because the language is such an important part of this
Mhm,
book. It's literally the entire thing the magic system is built around, which we'll talk about.
mhm.
But just the words were so beautiful to read and, like, sit with, and the imagery was so strong that it was just kind of a delight to actually, like, sit down and read it.
Yeah, I completely agree. There are so many places in this book that I actually stopped and reread a paragraph because I thought it was so beautifully written. I just wanted to read it again, which was a change from Pern, which had some really lovely scenes and lovely lines, but the prose were definitely not the focus of Anne McCaffrey, where I feel that the prose were really a focus of Ursula K. Le Guin. She was really focused on how the book sounded, and that was quite a delight. It felt like eating, like, a really squishy cake.
Hot take, Ursula K. Le Guin is good at writing. Nebula
Yeah.
Award winner Ursula K. Le Guin.
You heard it here first. In 2024,
Uh-huh.
Ursula K. Le Guin is a good writer. So, to dive right into the plot, the book begins by saying that it is a story of the great mage Sparrowhawk before he was a household name. So, in this world, he is one of the most famous wizards that has existed. But this is the story of him kind of establishing who he is as a person. This is a story before those great tales are told. And this immediately sets up the way the book is going to be told, which is from a very distant perspective. We kind of have this very storytelling way of reading it where it feels like you're sitting around a campfire listening to someone tell the story instead of this book that's very closely in our main character's perspective. And it feels really like the Odyssey. It feels really like the Aeneid in that way where he's going on this adventure and we're popping from place to place. And we do have these really intimate, intense moments of his internal strife and struggle and feelings and thoughts, but it does have this distance to it, which is quite nice. It felt really good to read. It felt very refreshing to read a book like this. I don't know, what do you think of that distance perspective?
That is really interesting. And I'll bring it up later, especially in the last chapter. But I thought A was very good, and B, it also gave the narrative the flexibility to shine the light in different places.
Mhm.
A, it allowed it to like take a more historical look.
Mhm.
So you could look back a lot of the stories going from place to place. And sometimes instead of following Ged and Sparrowheart like through his stories, you get to like stay on an island and like see it for the next dozen or so years. And that's
Mhm.
like a really beautiful thing.
Mhm.
I'll talk about it more at the finale because I really noticed the distance in the last chapter.
Yeah. Okay. So the book starts really with his birth, and we do have immediately another dead mother. His mother dies. I don't remember if it's in childbirth or just early on in his childhood. So I'm kind of interested to see how many books we can get through before we have two living parents. It's just a personal journey that I'm on. But his father is alive and is a smith in a very small village. And in the beginning of his life, his name is Dunny. And I'll get into the importance of names in a minute, but basically, you have a true name that you're given on your 13th birthday. And he hasn't received this true name yet. So he's born in this small village and he notices that his aunt, who is unnamed, is using magic, and he kind of tries to use one of her spells to call goats to him, but he doesn't actually know the spell to disperse the goats. So she notices this and she helps him, and he asks her to teach him magic. She does agree to teach him magic, as long as he keeps the magic to himself and doesn't use it in the earshot of other people. So we have his first teacher, who is his aunt, and he is taught by her for the first few years of his journey in magic until the town is raided by a group of people. And these people are really described in a way that makes them sound like they're Norse. They are white skinned, they have light hair, they come from the north, they are warlike people who raid these places from boats. So they sound very Norse coded.
Can I just say that
Mhm.
I also took a note about that and just wrote Vikings. So it's funny that we're both like picking up what the other person is putting down, or I guess what like Kayla Gwyn is putting down.
Yeah, I think she's very clear that these are supposed to be Vikings. And the town is very worried because they're just a small village. They aren't a warlike people, and they really think that this is going to be a last stand. They're not going to survive. His father starts making spearheads, which they're like the halves of the spearheads are like broom handles and things like that, because again, they don't have any weapons. They're not trained in warfare. The aunt goes and she hides in a cave with a few other people, and Sparrowhawk decides, our Dunny decides that he is going to cast a fog spell when these people make landfall. And this is described as a binding spell that binds mist together. So he is able to cover the entire village with fog, and he's able to maintain this spell for multiple days. And because he does this, the townsfolk are able to pick off this invading force one by one, to very few casualties. And they are able to fend them off completely. Now, because he was maintaining this spell for multiple days, this causes him to fall into this kind of death-like state because he overextended his magic. And this is something that happens multiple times throughout the book. He overextends his magic and he almost dies, and he's kind of existing in this space between life and death throughout this period while he is recovering, and usually someone else has to pull him back from basically death. So this is when we meet Ogion, who is his second teacher. And Ogion comes to town and heals him because he hears of his great deed of summoning this mist. And Ogion says that on his 13th birthday, he will come to the naming ceremony and give him his true name. Do you want to talk about the importance of names?
Sure. The magic system, and they have such beautiful descriptions of it, and they really go into detail. It's I don't know, would you classify this as a soft magic system or a hard magic system?
Never very good at making that distinction. We know the rules of the magic, but we don't actually know the limitations of it. So I would say that it's still pretty soft because it seems like the magic kind of works when the plot needs it to work.
Yeah, there's a lot of wizards knowing where to go because that's what wizards do.
Mhm.
But yeah, so in the world of Earthsea, all things have a true name, and the world is even described as existing as one long telling, that all things are made like in the telling of things, which is such a writer thing to do to make a world based on words like, well, obviously, it's a book.
There's a really beautiful quote from that. Can I read it? It's in actually the very end of the book, but it's not
Sure.
like giving anything away. My name and yours, and the true name of the sun, or a spring of water, or an unborn child, are all syllables of the great word that is very slowly spoken by the shining of the stars. There is no other power, no other name.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that quote. So the magic works by either naming things, you can have power over things by naming things, and by like speaking spells into existence. Part of it does seem to be by will. There is things that seem to just happen because they happen.
Mhm.
But for the most part, the way that the magic works is you name spells or you know the names of spells and you use that to, do magic.
Yeah, and there are illusion spells that seem like they function a little bit differently, but the power of knowing something's name is to have power over it. So they are also very careful about who knows their true name. So he has his naming ceremony, and I'm actually going to read this quote because I think it's quite beautiful too. The witch took from the boy his name, Dunny, the name his mother had given to him as a baby. Nameless and naked, he walked into the cold springs of the Ar, where it rises among rocks under the high cliffs. As he entered the water, clouds crossed the sun's face, and great shadows slid and mingled over the water of the pool around him. He crossed to the far bank, shuddering with cold, but walking slow and erect as he should through the icy, living water. As he came to the bank, Ogion, waiting, reached out his hand and clasped the boy's arm, whispered to him his true name, Ged. So beautiful. Also, we have this symbolism of the shadow, which is going to become important soon.
There's a lot of foreshadowing in this book that feels very like good and natural.
Good pun.
Yeah, I know. Eh, it's just it's such a lovely contrast to Pern, which
Yeah.
was like they would introduce a thing and then immediately resolve it. So less foreshadowing and more just happening.
Yeah, we really have these lovely long setups in this book that is so nice after reading Perm. So Ogion takes him with him with his, like Ged wants to go with him, and Ogion becomes his second teacher. But Ged is a young boy, and he's really annoyed by how slow this teaching is. And Ogion kind of is this like kind of naturey guy. He talks to him about the importance of learning names and how if he doesn't understand what a name means and what 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 the object is or the creature is or the plant is, he can't really understand how to command it. And there's like another really wonderful quote, which maybe I need to stop doing all these quotes because there are so many of them.
No, more quotes. More quotes.
But Ged is really like, I don't think that this is important. And he doesn't understand like what the point is, like what the use of these different plants are, because Ogion's like, you need to learn the name of all these plants, the true name of all these plants. And Ged's saying, like, well, what is its use? And Ogion says, when you know the fourfoil, which is a plant, in all its seasons, root and leaf and flower, by sight and scent and seed, then you may learn its true name, knowing its being, which is more than its use. What, after all, is the use of you, or of myself? Is Gaunt Mountain useful, or the open sea? To hear, one must be silent. Ah, such a beautiful line.
I know. And what a beautiful philosophy of like life. There's so many good little quotes about philosophy of life in this book.
And the act of listening and learning as a means of knowing is so beautiful.
Yeah, there's a lot of listening and thinking in this book, and it
Mhm.
sounds boring, but it's not. Which is I think I do wanna say, which I feel like we haven't talked about enough, is, like, a lot of the early characterization of Ged is as, like, a very, like selfish isn't necessarily the right word, but, like, boastful and prideful. At a young age, he's, like, quite powerful.
Yeah,
Even with when he's with his aunt, the witch, he's masters her skills while he's still very young and wants more magic. A lot of his early scenes with Ogion, is that how you say it?
I think so.
A lot of his early scenes with Ogion is him being like, "Why aren't you doing magic?" And Ogion being like, "I don't need to." And then him being like, "Will you teach me magic?" And he's like, "I am." And he's like, "Not like this."
Yeah.
It's very it's I mean, he's like I think 14 in this and and 15 when he shows up later at the magic school. And he just feels so 14 and 15. It's very sweet and also he's quite annoying in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, I was really afraid we were going to have another Falar situation where Falar is extremely boastful and prideful and pompous and is never humbled, and whatever he does is right no matter what it is. And I was like, "Oh, no." But we do get a scene where he is humbled, which is coming up. It kind of his relationship with Ogion does kind of remind me of Zuko and Iroh's relationship in Avatar: The Last Airbender, where Zuko's like, I'm ready to learn the next firebending set. I'm ready to learn how to lightning bend. I'm ready to do these things. And Iroh's like, oh, you need to slow down a little bit. He's super impulsive. Obviously, Ged is coming from a different place than Zuko, where Ged is coming from this place where he's been told his whole life how great he is, how he's destined to do great things, how naturally gifted he is. And he has really kind of internalized that in a way that's not great. Whereas Zuko's, yeah, I'm not even going to get into it right now. But the relationship is very similar, where Ogion and Iroh are both these really gentle older men that use their gentleness to guide these very willful young boys in a way that's quite a lovely relationship, just like so lovely. And Ogion comes in later in the book in a way that's just I like teared up a little bit when I read it.
Beautiful scene, but
Yeah,
unfortunately, Ogion is not the one who teaches Ged most of his magic.
right.
Ged demands more knowledge, and Ogion says, "I can teach you in a slow way, or you could go to this magic school and learn a lot there." And Ged's immediately like, "Magic school, please."
Yeah, but before this happens, Ged does this is an example of his really kind of bombastic nature, of his really prideful nature. He finds a girl picking flowers, and she basically goads him using his pride and asks him, well, like, "Do you know a spell to raise the dead?" And he goes to Ogion's library and he finds the book, and it's kind of described that he's not even reading it of his own volition. He's just taking in the knowledge, and it summons this like kind of darkness around him that Ogion is able to disperse. And then they have this conversation surrounding like, well, you want to learn fast, you need to go to Roke, which is the wizard island where the wizard school is. And Ged is like, yeah, that option. I want to do that one.
It's a really great scene where Ged is tricked by the girl who
Mhm,
we later find out is the daughter of a sorceress, where you
mhm.
just sort of see the beginning of a dynamic that you've seen earlier in the book playing out, where like Ged gets all hot and like storms off and then
Mhm.
immediately stumbles into something that's like too big for him and kind of needs to get bailed out by someone smarter
Yeah.
and more powerful than him.
And we also see Ogion's power for the first time here too.
Yeah, for the most part, he's just like hanging out, herding sheep or goats. He herds goats and just kind of like holding a staff and being a wizard.
Honestly, it sounds like a great life.
There's
I
so
would like
many.
I would like
Yeah.
that life. So, Ged goes to the wizard school. He there are some I don't think it's very important to talk about
Ooh,
the
I
boat.
do think it's important to
Oh,
say how
okay.
he gets there because I think it's pretty important. He gets there on a boat named Shadow.
Okay, yeah. But there's like a whole plot line with this boat. He like basically is able to use magic to point to the island, but he can't use weather magic very well, but he can use a guiding spell to point to the island. But the boat is named Shadow, which is also foreshadowing. And he gets to the wizard school. There is a kind of a reference to the Aeneid here that's referenced again. It's referenced 2 more times throughout the book, where he goes into the through this door into the wizard school, and it's basically a reference to the Gate of Ivory and the Gate of Horn in the Aeneid when Aeneas is in the underworld. And he's told, when you leave the underworld, you have to leave through the Gate of Horn and not the Gate of Ivory. Because the Gate of Horn is the gate of reality, and the Gate of Ivory is the gate of dreams. So we do kind of have this setup. And I don't know how I know that Ursula Le Guin did this intentionally just because it's referenced so many times in the book. At first, I thought it was just like this little Easter egg, but then we do have all of these kind of references to reality and dream and kind of facing your issues or existing in like a dream and how darkness can exist in a dream in a way that it can't exist in reality. So we have this first Aeneid reference, which is there, which I was very delighted by. I read the Aeneid when I was in high school because I was a nerdy Latin kid. So I always am very delighted when I see those kinds of references.
And as someone who has never read the Aeneid, it went right over my head.
I don't think it's important to have caught that. I just love it. So he enters the school and he pretty immediately meets 2 other students named Jasper and Vetch. And Jasper is also this pretty pompous guy. They immediately kind of have this little this little like show me what you got contest where they are showing off to each other and showing off their magic. And Jasper is kind of a jerk. Vetch is really a sweetheart. And he and Vetch become really close friends. And he and Vetch, sorry, and Ged and Jasper become immediate rivals.
There's an element of class in this. So
Mhm.
class is sort of mentioned throughout the book. Gonth, where Gad is born, is like kind of a poor place, and then
Mhm.
he is also poorer because he's kind of up with the goat herders up in the hill.
Yeah.
And the school is really where Ged starts interacting with people of different class. While it's sort of implied that, and I mean, you see it later that Vetch is sort of close to Ged's class. Like Vetch comes from sort of like I guess a middle class background is the implication. Ged is sort of like poor, and Jasper is rich or comes from some sort of royal family. And that's part of the dynamic between the 3 of them
Mhm.
is class. And class is throughout this book, but it's always sort of like a quiet thing.
Yeah, it doesn't come to the forefront, but I think that a part of why Ged has this kind of chip on his shoulder is that he really feels like he has something to prove coming from this nowhere background and having all this innate skill. He thinks that there's like a superiority there. Whereas Jasper obviously feels the opposite, that this is something that really only exists for the elite. But this is really the first time when he enters the school that he's faced with class. Before this, he hasn't actually had to deal with this. And he doesn't really deal with it very well because he has this rivalry with Jasper. He kind of creates this clique of other wizards around him. He's really pompous and overbearing, even though Jasper is like a little bit ahead of him because he's just been in the school a little bit longer. And throughout this time, there are also a lot of conversations about how, again, names are used and how it commands things. So to know something's name allows you to command it. And Ged does also ask one of his teachers, well, what if I wanted to change the form of something? Because there is illusion magic where you can make something appear to be changed. You can make water appear to jump out of a soil and you can drink it. But once that illusion dissipates, then you still feel parched and nothing is wet anymore. And he wants to know, like, well, how do we actually create that? And his teacher says, you have to change its name. But to do so can disrupt the equilibrium of the world and cause everything to lose its name. So we as wizards have to be really careful. So it's just like with great power comes great responsibility kind of thing.
That's funny. I wrote a lot about Jedis in this book because there's a lot of like to go to the dark side, you have to stray from the light, or like there is equilibrium and balance in the
Yeah.
world. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we also have this kind of lovely teacher who all he does all day is write the names of things, and the students have to read all the names and take in all of this information each day, and then at the beginning of the next day, it's a new list of names. And they're just trying and there's, like, no speaking while they're here. It is just them trying to learn as many names as possible, and through this, we also learn that, like, some of these wizards and mages will spend their entire life searching for a single name of a single star, and they will just search and search and search for this one name, and that's their entire journey as a wizard, and it's still seen as time well spent because it's this pursuit of knowledge and this pursuit of understanding, and that's so I just found that really lovely that this
Wonder
small.
why.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder why the teacher would find that. But anyway,
Yeah, I just love that. I mean, yeah, but it's just such a simple, like, even this one you do one thing your whole life, and that's still considered a valid calling. You don't have to perform these great feats of magic. You don't have to go on these crazy or, like, you don't have to go on these epic quests. You don't have to do anything like that. All you have to do is search for the name of a star, which is quite lovely. And then we, get an animal companion. Ged finds this little called an otak, and it's a ferret-like creature that's kind of a vicious little creature, but because he's able to call it by its name, he then it becomes his little friend. And then it's with him for a long time. And it's cute. I don't know. What did you think of this animal companion?
it's funny because we just had a book where there was a dragons were animal companions, and then this one's just like a little bit of a ferret. I like it. Once again, it sort of exists kind of just to be a plot contrivance and
Yeah,
adorable,
yeah.
but it's hard to like he's described as so cute, so it's hard.
He is cute. I wish he was, like, had a little bit more characterization. He's also like, Jasper kind of says, like there's, like, a thing where Gontish, wizards, like, can tame these little otak things, but Jasper kind of ridicules him for it, again, as a class thing.
Yeah, it doesn't have it's an animal that doesn't have this symbol of like a crow or like a raven.
Yeah, and a lot of the, like, archmages do have kind of a familiar animal, so there's I think it's a raven that the main archmage has.
There's only one archmage at a time, but yes, the archmage has a raven.
Oh, well, the one that well, before he's replaced by the next archmage.
Spoilers.
Well, we're getting to that. So, eventually, there is kind of a big blowout between, Ged and Jasper, where they kind of are trying to one up each other with magic, and Jasper basically says to him, like, "Well, can you call someone from the dead?" Which, like, lucky for Ged, he does know how to do that because that was the one spell he read in Ogion's library.
Yeah, once again, someone is triple dog daring him to call a spirit from the dead, and like lucky for Ged, he's actually got it because he read it once and it burned itself in his brain because it's an evil spell, and that's sort of how it works.
Yeah, it kind of reminded we're going to be reading a Terry Pratchett novel next. And there's a wizard in the Discworld series named Rincewind who really only knows one spell, but it's like the most powerful spell in the world, and it wants him to use it. And when he found it, it kind of like shot itself into his little brain, and he can't unknow it. So he's this really powerful wizard, even though he's really bad at most magic, just because he knows this one really powerful spell that would like unmake the world if it's used. But it wants to be used. And that it kind of I don't think that's exactly the same thing that is happening here, but it did really remind me of that.
It's I believe it's a weird trope. So Earthsea is kind of like the first magic wizard school book, but
Mhm.
another magic wizard school book that we read is A Deadly Education, and in that the main character is learning magic, and she can like read evil terrible spells and they just like stick in her head. So it's interesting to see like an early canon book some of these ideas that you then see in further books becoming, coming into existence in the canon, then seeing them work their way through it.
I'm not sure when Terry Pratchett wrote that in his book, but as we know, he's a satirist, and that was a commentary on this as a trope, but I don't know the date that he wrote that. But again, it is a commentary on this trope of the spell wanting to be used and burning itself into the brain of the wizard who can cast it. So he basically is like, fine, I'll do it. And he tries to summon this dead princess, and it almost kills him. He is he really I think he also hurts Jasper too, and he unleashes this kind of shadow being from death, from this place that has no name.
He succeeds. I think that's actually worth talking about. He succeeds. He summons this long dead princess of myth,
Elfarin.
Elfarin, but she's speaking of myth, she's a very Helen of Troy character
Mhm.
where like her beauty caused a bunch of wars and sunken islands. And then so he resurrects her, and in the process of doing that, basically opens a portal to death, which is beautifully described throughout this book
Oh, yeah.
as like a land without sun.
Without water. It's a dry place, it's described as such a lovely line. Sorry,
Yeah,
continue.
because so much of Earthsea, it's an archipelago, is about water and
Mhm.
traveling in water and being around water. It's so interesting that death is a dry place. And anyway, he out of the portal basically comes this shadow, which immediately starts clawing his face and neck up and almost kills him.
Yeah, and it takes the archmage saves him in the end, and actually has to it is killed in the process of trying to contain this creature. And this is where we have this extremely humbling event in Ged's life, where he it takes him months and months to recover from this. He can't speak. He's extremely weak. He's bedbound for a while. He cannot perform magic for a while. He falls really far behind all of his classmates. He's afraid of using magic because of what he did, because of what he caused, because he caused this other person to die. And he also knows that he's really only protected by the wards of the school and the island, and that this shadow creature is waiting for him once he leaves. So it's this really amazing, humbling experience. And even once he starts to be able to continue his studies, to be able to start learning and casting spells again, he still is really nervous and fearful that he's going to make another mistake. And he recognizes that he is not as strong as he used to be, which is this it's really beautifully described, and he then carries that with him for the rest of the book. So it's this lovely moment of character growth that was definitely needed because he was pretty much a jerk before this incident, and it changes him as a person, as a wizard, which is it's quite lovely. So as he is recovering, Vetch comes to him because he has received his wizard staff. He is about to graduate, and they have this really lovely conversation where Vetch basically tells him, like, I'm going to this place, and then Vetch tells him his true name. So they share their true name with each other, which is this really intimate exchange of trust, because if you know someone's true name, you can control them. So it's just this lovely exchange of friendship, and then Vetch leaves.
It is also worth saying that from now on, to some degree, Ged was like marked by the shadow before because of all the foreshadowing of the shadow.
Yeah.
But after this, to some degree, like the the thing that Ged did, like, clings to him, like, people can sort of see it in him, so
Yeah.
not only are people afraid of him, like, he and, like, now he's scarred because of it, there's, like, something fundamentally is different in him. So,
Yeah.
like, Vetch still treating him the same is actually, like, a really beautiful, personal, like, step to him that other wizards are not taking.
Yeah. Ged does have a conversation with one of the teachers who says that the shadow doesn't have a name because it's like it is death, and death is the silence that happens before and after that long name that is spoken, that everything exists within. So that will come back later. Eventually, he is able to graduate. He earns his wizard staff, and he passes through, again, that gate of horn and ivory. The gate is horn and ivory. It's like the floor is made of ivory. I think the archway is made of horn. And he is sent to this archipelago to deal with the dragon. And here we have our dragon scene.
I do also say, since we've been talking a little bit about class and stuff, and like
Mhm,
how Ged was so prideful and like thought he was, even though he came from lowly beginnings, he deserved more.
mhm.
Like, a huge part of characterization after his injury is that he's sent off to a pretty poor sort
Yeah,
of backwater place that
yeah.
typically wouldn't get a wizard, but some dragons moved in and are causing a ruckus, and, they need a wizard just to sort of figure it out and, like, keep them safe, and actually, instead of being insulted, Ged is actually, like he's like, "He deserves this."
I think
You know, he's
relieved
Mhm.
that he's not going to be in the spotlight because he is in this place. He's like, yeah, in this boondock place, instead of being in a king's court or a feudal lord's court.
It's just a much humbler Ged than the Ged of the beginning of the book, and it's, like, really where you start to see the Ged who will become who we see at the end of the book.
And who, yeah, and who becomes this sparrowhawk figure that we also hear about in the very beginning of the book as this really he becomes really, internal and really introspective, after this event, where he is really considering what his limitations are and what he can and can't do, even though he does still, in many places, push the boundaries of what he's capable of doing. It's not because he's trying to show off or show his skill. In these other places, it's because he's either fighting for his life or trying to help someone else. So when he is sent to this place, he kind of delays speaking to the dragon and dealing with the dragon because currently they aren't actually an issue. They're kind of they've overtaken this island, but this island was had already been overtaken by these pretty cutthroat pirates. So no one was sad that the dragon killed them to take their treasure, and the dragons have not yet really been coming into the town and taking, eat feasting off of the flocks of sheep or harming any of the humans. So he
Do you mind
does.
if I add a little bit of clarity for that?
Sure.
So this is when we see our this is the dragon. This is the whole dragon that we're here to see. So we find out pretty early that a dragon had set up in a fortress close to where this village actually is that he's going to stay in. And dragon went there for this is a very typical dragon. Big scaly dragon saw a bunch of treasure that some raiders had hoarded and decided to kill all the people who were hoarding it. Everyone who wasn't in the castle fled, and then he's just living in this castle. What we find out, and that's been the way for at least a little bit, like no one cares, the dragon's fine, he's just hanging out. What
Mhm.
happens is a lady dragon flies in and she lays some eggs with him. And now there's 9 little baby dragons that aren't just having fun hanging out on the island. They're like getting older and bigger, and they're worried that they're going to start raiding and killing. And that's why Get is set out.
Yeah, but you have to wonder, what is this big dragon eating?
Yeah, it kind of got the impression that he didn't even like need to eat
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, I could believe that. He is kind of, again, this quasi godlike thing. So it makes sense that if you like, they are so old and they have this kind of eldritch quality to them, that they kind of exist outside of this natural understanding of existence.
Yeah, what I thought was so interesting about the dragons in this book and is that you have these like young dragons that are just kind of animals to some degree. They don't seem
Mhm.
very smart and they're just sort of flying around. And then you have these older dragons that have maybe been around for since land existed. They talk a lot about how like land came out up from under the sea and that's how like that's their creation myth or maybe not a myth because it's, but
I mean, it's whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It's still their creation myth.
yes, but dragons seem to be around from that time to some degree, and they seem to have memories of things that have, like, been lost from that time.
Yeah, and it's also described that the true language, the true names of things is the language of dragons. So this is just their natural tongue. And it's you can't lie when you're speaking the true language, the true tongue, but dragons actually can lie when they're speaking the true tongue because it's their language. So the names of things are the dragon's language. But her Ged has not met the dragon yet because he's been delaying because he's really afraid of testing his power. He's afraid that he's going to fail again. He's afraid that he's going to harm other people. So he kind of builds these relationships with the people of the village, specifically one man who is named, I don't remember his name,
I got it. It's Pechvarr.
Petchvari.
Pechvari.
Yes, this guy named Petchvari, and Petchvari teaches him how to really take care of a boat and sail, which will be important later in the book. But he learns this craft from Petchvari, and he also kind of helps Petchvari by casting these small spells on his boat to make it better. And this is a seafaring village. It's kind of described as all of these houses exist like on stilts. It's like over the water.
Very Venice-y, where, like,
Yeah.
there aren't any roads to get from one house to another. You gotta just, like, get on your boat and head over.
Yeah, it's like I feel like it's something that would exist in, like, the bayou, right?
Hmm.
But Petchvari's child actually becomes really ill, and he pleads with Ged to heal him, and Ged realizes pretty early on that he's not going to be able to save this child, but he tries anyway, even though he knows that this isn't going to be a probably have a good outcome because he cares so much about his friend, where he walks into death basically to try to pull the child out of death. It does not work, and he does almost die again because of this attempt. And through this, he realizes that the shadow that's following him is actually really close and has just been waiting and wants to pretty much overtake him, take over his body so that it can take over his power and use it to evil ends.
It seems as though the Archmage had not necessarily banished the shadow back into some like formless place that it came from before, but like close to death. And in like running into him on the way to, and like in this like deathland that people cross to go to death, he sort of draws its attention back or draws it back so that it can start following him again.
Yeah. And the quote around the what the shadow is, he said the archmage says, "You summoned a spirit from the dead, but with it came one of the powers of unlife. Uncalled, it came from a place where there are no names. Evil, it wills to work evil through you. The power you had to call, it gives power over you. You are connected. It is the shadow of your arrogance, the shadow of your ignorance, the shadow you cast. Has a shadow a name?" And he realizes that it's very close to him. So he decides, you know what? I'm gonna fight this dragon now because he realizes that the shadow is probably afraid of the dragon too. So if he goes to the dragon to fight the shadow will be too afraid to follow.
Sorry,
Which
that's not what happens.
what?
What
Are
happened?
you
No, what happens is he knows the shadow's coming and he needs to run away, but he can't leave the people like on their own to fight. Like he can't just be like, I gotta go, there's a shadow, bye. So he's like, all right, what I'm gonna do is I am going.
he says that he knows the shadow won't follow him to the dragon's island. So he will be safe as long as he is there with the dragon.
Sure, but he's going to run like he needs to do it because he needs to run away.
Okay, fine. But he does acknowledge that he knows he will be safe while he's on the Dragon Island because the shadow will not follow him there.
Sure, yes. Okay. We're in agreement that he deals with the dragon not because he's like worried. He like is like, "Oh, if I hang out with this dragon, the shadow's not going to come." He's like, "All right, got to go deal with this shadow, but I can't leave
Yeah.
even though I need to. So I'm going to deal with this which is it's such a funny thing where he's like, "Well, I guess I got to go I'm going to go deal with this dragon so I can deal with the shadow." And all of the people in the village are like, "You're going to what now? Deal with the dragon? Are you insane?" And he's like, "Anyway, bye."
Yeah, so he takes his little boat that he built with Pechvari to the dragon, and he kind of calls them out. The little ones come out, the babies come out, and they're, like, big and fearsome still, they're just, like, little compared to the big dragon. And he is able to bind them, so he binds their wings to their body so they drop into the ocean and drown, which is a really interesting way of dealing with it. But he kills, like, a bunch of them. I don't actually remember the number. There are 9, I think, but he
There's
doesn't.
9, he sees 6, and he fights 5. 2 of them, they, like, come at him, and he's just like, "Be suck if you couldn't fly anymore," and they, like, drop and drown in there, and then 3 of
Yeah,
them come at him, so he can't just, like, spell them. So
yeah.
he turns into a a trucking dragon and fights them as a dragon, and it's so cool, and he never does it again in the entire book because it's not about how cool your magical powers are, even though that was super dope.
So he does mention because he turns into a dragon, then he turns back into himself fairly quickly because it's really dangerous to keep a different form for any long period of time. You forget who you are. So there is a reason why he doesn't turn back into a dragon later.
I know. It's such a very clear distinction between young Ged, who would be like, it's super cool to be a dragon, and adult Ged, who's like, you can't be a dragon for too long because then you turn into a dragon and you lose yourself, which is a bad thing.
I think he does have a conversation before he goes to the wizard school with Ogion where he's like, "When are you gonna teach me how to turn into creatures?" And Ogion's like, "I'm not. I'm not gonna do that." And he's like, "Aw." And the reason for it becomes clear later in the book, but Ogion's just like, you're not ready for that." And he's really annoyed that Ogion won't teach him. But he does turn into a dragon, and it's super cool. He talks about, like, how the dragon breathes fire on him, but because he's in a dragon form, it doesn't actually hurt him, which is like, yeah, that makes sense. And then he basically calls out to the big dragon. He's like, "I killed your kids. I'll kill more of them if you don't come and talk to me." And he realizes how absolutely massive this dragon is. He thought that it was this part of the tower, but then sorry, I'm trying to find the quote.
It is a really cool scene when they introduce the adult dragon.
Yeah, he says, "6 I have seen, 5 slain, 9 are told of. Come out, worms," which is a very fun line. So he calls out the big dragon. He does acknowledge that he's really afraid of dragon magic because it is really different from the sorcery that he has learned and that meant like humans can do. But it says what he had taken for a part of the tower was the shoulder of the dragon of Pendor as he uncurled his bulk and lifted himself slowly up. He was all afoot, his scaled head, spike crowned and triple tongue, rose higher than the broken tower's height, and his taloned forefeet rested on the rubble of the town below. His scales were gray black, catching the daylight like broken stone. Lean as a hound he was, and huge as a hill. Ged stared in awe. There was no song or tale that could prepare the mind for this sight. Almost he stared into the dragon's eyes and was caught, for one cannot look into a dragon's eyes. He glanced away from the oily green gaze that watched him and held up before him his staff and looked like a splinter, like a twig. Which, what a great description of this awesome dragon. And he has this conversation with the dragon. It kind of becomes apparent that dragons are not very paternal. This dragon is not very paternal. He doesn't really care that his children have died. He's not really angry about it.
He is upset, but he's not crazy mad about it.
He's
Not in the
like,
way like a person would be. He's like, "Hey,
yeah.
stop killing my kids."
Yeah, he's like, "Okay, like, don't kill them, but it's okay." Yeah, like they're just like he's not mad about it, which maybe dragons can't feel. Well, no, he definitely feels anger in the end.
I think it's more like he's a very old dragon. These are kind of young kids. It felt very reptilian in a sort of way where like it's just like a different relationship to their children.
I kind of wonder if they don't really see the dragons, if dragons don't see other dragons as really worth anything until they become intelligent. And these dragons, these baby dragons that first attack Ged, were obviously really animal like in their description and in their actions. Where this dragon is like the big dragon is really intelligent and ancient. So I wonder if it would be different if he slayed a dragon that has reached that point where it becomes intelligent. But the dragon sees that Ged has the shadow attached to him. He offers to tell Ged its name, and Ged remembers that his teacher told him that it doesn't have a name. He's not sure if the dragon is telling the truth or is trying to trick him. And he says, "It is very seldom that dragons ask to do men favors." And then the dragon says, "But it is very common for cats to play with mice before they kill them," which is such a good line. So he has this conversation with the dragon, and then he's finally able to compel the dragon to do what he wants because he does know the dragon's name, which is Yvald. And Ged is like not entirely sure that this is the dragon's name, but he read this name when he was studying in school, and he's pretty sure that it's the dragon's name. And the dragon gets really annoyed by this because he's like, "Ah, fuck! Now I have to do what you say." And Ged basically says like, "You and your children cannot go. You have to leave, and you can't." Does he say you have to leave?
No, he just says you can't come towards his village. You can't fly like south or something.
Yeah, he says you can't come any closer to the village. You cannot harm these people or their livelihood. And the dragon's like, "Okay, fine." But he's really annoyed. And the dragon just then the dragon does try to like he's like, want some of my jewels?" And I think he's trying to lure Ged closer to kill him. And Ged's like, "I do not want those." And then the dragon does try to kill him, but Ged is able to escape.
One of the funniest lines in the entire book is when the dragon is like, "You want some jewels?" and gets like, "Nah, thanks." And the dragon's like, "Man, didn't people used to like jewels?"
These men, they used to love these jewels. Now they don't anymore. The dragon is very funny.
It's a great dragon.
It's a good dragon. So we do have this reveal that Ged knows the dragon's name. The reason that this works and it doesn't feel like totally random placed in is again because we have this distance perspective as a reader being told a tale. If this was in a more intimate perspective that we are getting all of Ged's thoughts throughout the book, this would not have worked. If this was told the way that Pern was told, it would feel really, really annoying to read. But because we have this distance perspective, it's like this beautiful reveal that's really powerful, where Ged is able to win a battle with a dragon with a word instead of with any kind of fancy magic. It's just a word. And that's so lovely and again shows his growth as a wizard and as a person.
Yeah, even more than with a word, with the power of research.
Yeah. Learning. So the dragon is, you know, he vanquishes the dragon. The Isles write a song about him, so his fame is kind of spreading. He then, because he's really afraid of the shadow, he knows that it's hunting him. He tries to go back to the wizard school, the Isle of Roke, but because the protection magic around the school is so strong and views him as a threat because the shadow is so close to him, he is unable to actually get close to the school. He keeps getting pushed away by storms. So he travels around for a bit. He's told that he should go up to Oskill, which is that Nordic land, by a wizard or a wizard like man. He's not carrying a wizard staff, but he kind of gets the feeling that he has some kind of wizardness to him. He's told that he will be able to find a sword that can vanquish the shadow if he goes to Oskill. So he gets on a boat and he pays his way by being one of the rowers on the boat. And we kind of get a little bit of cultural information about the kind of people that live in Oskill, but I'm not going to get into that here because I don't think it's super important. And one of the men on the boat tells him that like he knows where to take him, so he follows this dude into the mountains.
We're saying a little bit, just to get a little bit, is that on the boat, he sees a vision of the shadow
Mm,
in this man, and then later sees him in his dream.
yeah.
So he's got a bad feeling about this guy, but then he's like, I know the way to go. And Ged's like, I guess I'll go with you.
Yeah. So the man is like leading him. It's kind of a dumb thing that he believes this guy.
It's a it's such an obvious trap.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we see what's going on here. But Ged doesn't. Maybe Ged does know, but he's just desperate. He's really desperate at this point. He's terrified of the shadow. So maybe it's like out of desperation more.
Yeah, the thing that we're not talking about is that, like, the thing that he feels of the presence of this thing is this super intense fear,
Hmm.
this overwhelming sense of fear and dread that, like, swallows him, and that's actually how he knows the shadow is close, is that he feels that.
Hmm.
So, like, it makes a little bit more sense that he's in a state of panic.
Yeah, yeah, and he's reacting out of panic. So he follows this guy and kind of into the wilderness, and this guy turns around and he's totally consumed by the shadow. The shadow has basically eaten this man's soul and overtaken him. And Ged raises his staff to try to fight the shadow, but the shadow says his name, says Ged, and it binds him, which is it's this really powerful moment where he's suddenly struck completely magicless just by his name being spoken against him. And he runs because there's nothing else he can do. He can't cast any magic. He can't strike against the shadow. He runs. And he does pass out in the snow. And he does wake up in a fancy bedroom. He kind of talks about it's described that he's in a feather bed for the first time and he's amazed by how soft the bed is, which is this kind of sweet moment where he's like, whoa, am I dead? Because this is so comfy. And we actually meet our first named woman, who is not a dead mythic woman, of the book on page 155 in my version, the first named woman. Her name is Sarat. And the reason I say the first named woman and the reason why I feel this is significant is we have so many named men throughout this entire book who only appear on like 2 pages. And we have female characters throughout this book, like his aunt, who is his first teacher, for example, is not named. So just throwing that out there, it was something that was a little bit frustrating that all of these really inconsequential men were named, but all of these women were not named who were on page for the same amount of time. You said you had feelings about this too that were opposite my feelings. Do you want to speak to
Yeah,
them?
I just don't care super much about whether or not they're named. I think that, like, the book does, like, a pretty good job of, like, showing different types of women and, like, not falling into, like, weird tropes about them. So, it didn't super bother me, but, I think it is worth noting that, like, they don't have a name and it's a book about names.
Yeah, it's a book about names. I think it wouldn't have bothered me as much if we didn't have so many named male characters that were on screen for so little or on page for such a little amount of time. But again, it just I think it's one of those things that like probably if this was written today, this wouldn't have happened. But because it was written in 1968, it's something that just is the fallback. But anyway, we have our first named woman. Her name is Sarat, and she's kind of the lady of the keep that he is in. He's currently in this kind of keep. He meets her. Is he her husband? I had COVID when I was reading this part, so it's a little hazy.
Yeah, yeah, oh, yeah. So he shows up at this castle that's brilliantly bright, but also incredibly cold, and everything is like dipped out in like silver. And she's described as this like beautiful white woman, like
He describes her as a caged white deer.
yeah, I think we sort of haven't talked about this book, but it is both intentionally sort of like subtle, but like a very intentional thing in this book is that a lot of the like good characters are like brown and like
Mhm.
described as like copper, like Get is copper and red, and Vet is like described as very dark and black, but a lot of the shitty characters are white,
Yeah.
which is, it's a book in 1969. It's kind of like a not subtle but like somewhat subtle jab. Like, you don't get people's skin colors until later in the book after you already start identifying with him,
Mhm.
which is like, I know something Ursula K. Guin was like trying to do. But so the whole place is like white and silver and shiny. And she's like really beautiful. He doesn't, we talked about how there's not a lot of women in the book. He hasn't seen a lot of women, especially like like beautiful rich women. So he's like he eh, he's kind of startled by her or like confused by her, and then she's young and her husband is like 3 or 4 times her age, and also described as like very white, but like very old.
Yeah, you do kind of get this feeling that she's trying to seduce him, but that there's absolutely no reciprocation on his side. There is a scene earlier in the book when he's still at the wizard school where there is this woman who is accompanying her husband to the school to kind of see the mages, and the boys are talking about how beautiful she is. And Ged says, "She's just a woman," which I didn't read as like sexist, him being sexist. I read it more as him just like not caring about the like ideas of beauty. He just doesn't seem like he's that interested in women, which is an interesting thing. He seems a little bit like he might be like Ace or Arrow, which is quite sweet. I mean, I think that's like a modern read. I don't know that Ursula K. Le Guin was trying to do that, but he doesn't really seem like he's affected by Saret's beauty in a way other than being, like you said, kind of startled or unsure how to proceed with it.
He's like appreciative of it, but it like in the same way you're like appreciative of like a really beautiful tree, or like I think it's
Yeah.
interesting that he compares her to a deer, you know?
There's like an aesthetic attraction there, maybe not even attraction, there's just an acknowledgement of her beauty, which is interesting. I liked that kind of characterization of him. But she does show him around this castle, and she takes him down to this room and shows him.
Oh, it is worth saying that this is the place he was led to, and they are right, like, he's safe there, the shadow can't come in, and he
Oh,
can't
yes.
feel it either.
Yeah, there is some kind of protection around the castle that's keeping the shadow out. So he was pulled into that safe space after he passed out, in the cold. But Sarah leads him to the stone at the base of the keep, and she does try to get Ged to touch it. And she says, if you touch it, it will show you how to defeat your shadow. But Ged pretty much immediately understands that this stone is what is making this castle so cold and what is creating this kind of bubble around this castle, and that it is something of immense evil. He tells her you shouldn't touch it yourself. It could corrupt you, and she admits that she already has touched it. And we do have this kind of Galadriel moment. I don't know if you like noticed that, or if that kind of it kind of took me out of it a little bit, because she has this moment where she's like, it shows you what was, what is, and what, I don't think she says like has not yet come to pass, but I think she says what will be.
Um,
But it's the same line basically that Galadriel says to Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring, when they're like looking at that like
there's
well.
there's some stuff when they talk about wizards where they're like, "Wizards don't meet by accident," that really feels like Gandalf being like, "A wizard is never late, he's always
Yeah,
on time."
yeah.
I definitely think that Ursula K. Le Guin read Lord of the Rings and wanted to take some of it and put it in her book.
Yeah, which is fine. But like that along with the way that Sarah is described as this beautiful, glowing white woman sounds so much like Galadriel. But he's like, "No, no, no, I don't wanna touch it." She continues to try to persuade him, and this is when he realizes that the man that was sent that tells him that, "Oh, you'll find a sword that can help you defeat your shadow," earlier on, was sent by her to get him to come there, and that this was a plot to get him to touch the stone because they wanted the stone to overtake him and use his power, and it would have consumed him. And again, we have this other kind of Galadriel moment where, like, in Lord of the Rings, she's like, with instead of a Dark Lord, you would have a queen. We could rule together, you and I, kind of thing. And she has this similar speech to Ged, where I was like, "Oh, this is again, this is kind of like Galadriel being corrupted by her own ring, her own evil. Not, not a one-to-one, but it did really remind me of Galadriel, and I wonder if that's where that inspiration for this character was.
I do have to say this scene also reminded me, sorry to cut you
Oh
off,
no, I wanted
of
to ask you what your thoughts were.
yeah, this scene reminded me a little bit of The Green Knight. I haven't read
Mm.
the book, I've only seen the movie, so don't hate on me, but a little bit the scene with the at the end with, like, the king and the queen who are kinda trying to just seduce the knight or Gawain. So, I think it borrows from a lot of stuff, and I really liked this
Yeah.
scene kind of because it really felt like it was playing with a lot of these myths.
Yeah, the scene in The Green Knight is very different from the scene in the book, or in this I don't know if it's really a book, it's a tale, right? It's a romance.
Mhm.
And I've, like, listened to readings of it, I haven't done, like, a close reading of it myself, but it is a little bit more lighthearted than in the movie. But yeah, I definitely see what you're saying there too. So he realizes that he has to escape, basically, and he realizes that she is actually also being trapped there. She tries to escape with him, and she says that she can't actually see the door to leave the keep because she's been trapped. So he does help her get out, and they are able to leave the safety of this castle of the walls. Once they are outside, there are these monsters that have been summoned that they do kind of remind me of the Stygphalian birds from the Hercules myth, these birds that are made out of metal that are really dangerous, and they're kind of coming after them. They also kind of remind me just of gargoyles, but when he leaves, he sees the body of the little otak ferret thing that was his friend, and he becomes enraged. And so we have the death of his little animal companion, which is very sad. Sarah turns into a gull and tries to escape, and he realizes that Sarah is actually the witch who, in the beginning of the book, was the mother of that girl who got him to learn that spell to summon the
No,
dead.
it's the girl.
Oh,
It's the
she's the
daughter.
girl.
Yeah, she's the
Oh,
girl.
man, I had
Yeah.
COVID when I was reading this. The brain fog was bad. But she was that person. Is her face changes once she's out of the keep, and he recognizes her. She turns into a gull to try to escape, but the bird creatures do kill her. Then Ged turns into a sparrow hawk and flies away and is able to escape. And he flies back to Ogion. So, is there anything you want to say about that scene before we move on to the last section, really, of the book?
No, I think it ruled. That's about it.
Well, it kind of reminded me of the scene in Howl's Moving Castle, the movie, when Howl is like the bird creature, and there are all those like wizards that have turned into those like lizard creatures, and he's like attacking the ship, and then all like the creatures come out and they like surround him, and you think he's going to be overtaken, and then he kind of is able to explode them off of him. That really reminded me of that scene. It was very cool. Like, I felt like I could visualize it really well. It was quite lovely.
I guess my only take on this scene is that it's kind of where you see the dark side of the
Mhm.
Force to
Yeah.
really continue the Jedi metaphor that I think is because they talk a lot about balance and
Mhm.
equilibrium, and in this scene, you really see what evil magic looks like. You see these like transformed creatures. You see that Sarah had basically bound herself to this power, and in doing so, it had basically literally bound her to this place where she couldn't leave.
Mhm.
And when she did leave, it like killed her.
Mhm.
So I think in some ways, you get to see the worst. Like if Ged does actually fall in this scene, you really do get to see like maybe what would have happened to Ged if he had been consumed by the shadow. Because in some way, these people are consumed by a different sort of power.
Yeah, we also have this moment where Ged can make a choice. If he stays there, he's safe from his own shadow, but he will then be consumed by this different kind of darkness. Or he can go back out into the world where his shadow is going to continue to hunt him and face that instead. And that is what he chooses. So he goes back to Ogion, and he finds him as a hawk, And Ogion has this really lovely, like, he's such a gentleman. And he says, so he lands on his arm, and Ogion says, I named you once, I think. And then it says, he strode into the house and entered, bearing the bird still on his wrist. He made the hawk stand on the hearth in the fire's heat and offered it water. It would not drink. Then Ogion began to lay a spell, very quietly, weaving the web of magic with his hands more than with words. When the spell was whole and woven, he said softly, Ged, not looking at the falcon on the hearth. He waited some while, then turned and got up and went to the young man who stood trembling and dull-eyed before the fire. Which, again, this book is beautifully written. That's such a beautiful way to reintroduce this relationship between these two people and how gentle Ogion is and how important Ogion is to Ged, where he didn't fly home. He flew to Ogion in this moment of absolute fear and terror. This is his safe space. This is his home. And we also learn in this moment why it is dangerous to stay in a form other than your own for too long, where he's basically completely wild after being a sparrowhawk for so long. He has no real memory. He's not able to speak for a while after he's turned back into a human. He's still really wild. And Ogion has to kind of coax his humanity back out of him. So he stays with Ogion for a little bit. Ogion makes him a new staff because he did lose his. It got burnt when he was fighting his shadow. He makes, I think it's like a yew staff.
It was a U staff.
Basically gives Ged this speech about if he is allowing the shadow to chase him, the shadow's always going to chase him, but what will happen if he turns his attention onto the shadow? He might be surprised. So Ged does leave, and on the hearth, he leaves a note for Ogion that says, Master, I go hunting. And he starts chasing the shadow instead of running from it. So there's this really lovely scene where it talks about how Ged is creating a boat, and it's mostly made out of magic. It's mostly held together with magic. He like is weaving the sail out of magic. It's not a like a real sail. And then he sails it partially with the craft he learned from that man in the archipelago and partially through spells. And this is where we get that really beautiful line about evil and water. So he's thinking about he's trying to find the shadow at sea, and he kind of thinks through the reason. It says, there out of the sea there rise storms and monsters, but no evil powers. Evil is of earth, and there is no sea, no running river or spring in the dark land where Ged had gone. Death is the dry place. Though the sea itself was a danger to him in the hard weather of the season, that danger and change and instability seemed to him defense and chance. When he met the shadow in this final end of his folly, he thought maybe at least he could grip that thing, even as it gripped him, and drag it with the weight of his body and the weight of his own death down into the darkness of the deep sea, from which, so held, it might not rise again.
I don't know if we've mentioned this. Sorry, but the reason that Ged is so afraid of the shadow and everyone is so afraid of the shadow is not because the shadow is going to kill him. It's because the shadow is going to possess him and
Mhm.
then use his magic, which we know he's like a very powerful, naturally powerful wizard, to just start, going on a rampage.
Mhm.
So part of it is him wanting to be safe. And that's also sort of why people are like, get him away from me, is because he needs literally dangerous, because if he gets consumed then he can hurt other people.
And he does have a ton of power in him, even though he has a little bit of reservations about using his power because of what he has experienced in his life. And if a shadow like this is able to take that power, it would be devastating for all of Earthsea. So we have this, he's, screwing his courage to the sticking place. He's going after it to whatever end he meets. He is ready to die to destroy this thing. We do have this kind of weird scene where he kind of washes up on an abandoned island. I don't know if you want to talk about this scene.
So what's important is that he chases his shadow down.
Oh, I'm talking about the abandoned island where those two people are stuck.
Yeah, so that he gets to the abandoned island because he is chasing his shadow, and he finally basically catches his shadow. He sees it and he's like, gunning for it. Like literally he turns his boat into like a speedboat with his with like mage wind or
Yeah.
whatever, and is like gunning for it. And then this shadow, because it has some of his power and can use some of his magic, coughs up a bunch of mist, which is the first trick he ever learned,
Mm.
and basically hides on a bunch of rocks, and then he dashes himself against it and like almost drowns.
Yeah.
So in confronting his shadow, he gets like absolutely wrecked and winds up on this like island, which I don't think is super important for this book, but is
No.
important for the next book,
Oh,
because he
okay.
gets half of a ring that like they talk about the tombs of a tuna, I think it is. I don't think that's how it's I don't think it's a tuna, but but he gets an item that's important for the next book.
Okay, I see. I kind of was wondering what the point of him on the island. There are two people who were stranded there, and he kind of assumes that they were stranded there as children and they've been living their whole life alone. And we spend like kind of a long time with him dealing with them, and I was like, what is the point of this? But it makes sense if it comes in a later book.
Yeah, I think it's also basically the last half of the book is just like him visiting different islands and seeing very different types of living.
Mhm. Yeah, and it shows us he does have this, like, remarkable act of kindness where these 2 people he, like, creates a spring of clear, fresh water on this landscape that does only have brackish water, so he's able to create this oasis on this island that these people have been living on and just surviving on for so long. Anyway, he gets off the island eventually, and he continues on. He finally lands, and he meets Fetch again. Fetch does not actually recognize him at first, but he eventually does. We also meet Fetch's little sister, whose name is Yarrow. We have a second named woman in the book.
So we found out also at this point that the shadow has taken something in the confrontation with him, has caused the shadow to take his form, and it's like
Oh,
literally
yeah.
running away from him across all of these islands.
Yeah, so people keep thinking that they've seen him, and they're freaked out by him because 'cause they're like, "Well, I just saw you," and they have that bad feeling from the shadow. So they feel kind of like he's this ill omen because they think they have seen him since they've seen his shadow.
Also, they're starting to get closer to each other, like he's
Mhm.
described as shadowy.
So we do have this little calm before the storm where he kind of gets to know Yarrow. She has a little baby tiny dragon-like thing on her wrist. Ged says, "Oh, you how like what a power like he basically says like what a fearsome land where little girls have dragons on their wrists." And she says, "Well, it's not a real dragon. It just looks like a dragon. They eat wasps," which is so I love that little detail. These little tiny dragons that eat wasps. And it's basically her pet. It's like a puppy. It steals like bread from her when she's making bread for their journey. And she's like this really sweet, very intelligent little girl. So I really liked her as a character. I wonder if she is going to play a larger role in later books.
I feel like there's a real chance, and the books have been written, and we could read them and look this
Yeah.
up. But like, she kind of gives me like a Jenny Weasley vibe, where like, I mean, it's a book that has like a wizard school in it, but like, I just kind of have a feeling that maybe they end up together. But who knows?
Yeah, I kind of did get that feeling too. I also felt like she had such a depth of character so immediately that it would be weird if she didn't pop up later in the books. Like, there are so many characters in this book that pop up for a page and then disappear, and they are really just like paper cutouts of a person. Like, you're like, "Okay, yeah, this is the poor fisherman. This is the ant that is nameless. This is, some
The Enchantress. This is
yeah, the old king."
At this point, you've also like been to a bunch of island, and you're like, ah,
Yeah.
these are the island folk. They like kind of blur together, where you have
Yeah,
like.
and she stands out so much as this character that feels very well-rounded. I just, like, can't imagine that she doesn't show up later.
Can I say one thing about Vetch's family is that he also has a little brother who's exactly Ged's age, and Ged looks at him, and because he doesn't have any magic, Vetch like came from like an Okeaw family, and then also Vetch is a wizard, so he kind of doesn't want for anything. So throughout this whole book, wizards don't pay for anything. They're like, you need a spell, and then people just give them free stuff. So it's
Mhm.
like being a wizard or being in a wizard's orbit is a cushy gig. So
Yeah.
he's just this 19-year-old boy who's just having a good life, kind of whittling,
But
and
he doesn't want to whittle. Like, Ged describes it as he's half-heartedly whittling. He's like he's a woodworker, but he, like, doesn't really love that he's a woodworker, which is very cute.
yeah, but Get is just like, "Wow, look at this kid who's my age that doesn't have all of my trauma and
Yeah.
knowledge of the world. Ugh, must be nice." It's like a really nice scene at the end where you can really
Yeah.
see how Get is this serious man who knows the way of things and is, like, really suffered and been through a
And
lot.
also his trauma is kind of self-inflicted. It's his fault that he is dealing with this situation that he is in.
Yeah, which
Um,
is part of him
yeah.
hunting the thing. It's like I have to go to my doom. Like I
Mhm.
recognize this and I'm accepting it and moving towards it.
Yeah, it is also really lovely to see how much love there is in Vetch's family too. Oh, we also learn in this in this section that Jasper, the petty rival of Ged, never earned his wizard staff. He never made it. He is kind of living this plush life, but he did not achieve what he set out to and what Ged and Vetch did achieve. So we kind of get this little like hee 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 in the end here with learning that Jasper did in fact suck. But Vetch decides that he is going to go with Ged and help him defeat his shadow. Ged doesn't really want him to, but Vetch is like, too bad, I'm coming with you. His sister makes them a lot of food for their journey. There's a sweet moment where the dragon like steals the bread and she's like, oh, well, like you won't have that food for your journey. So like you'll be thinking about it when you're hungry, when you're returning. And you'll look back at this moment and you'll laugh, like you'll feel happy. And so they set off and they basically journey past all known land. So they journey to the far point of the sea, past where anyone else has sailed. And they get to this kind of space that Ged eventually just steps off the boat. And when he steps off the boat, he steps onto sand. And he is walking up to his shadow as his shadow is walking up to him. And he raises his staff lights up. He and his shadow both reach out towards each other. And Ged then calls the shadow by its name, which is Ged. His staff does turn black, but he has defeated the shadow. And it's said that he was able to know his death, so he defeated it. And the way this scene is described, I'm not gonna read a quote from it because it's, like, long enough, and it's, like, just so the whole thing is so beautiful. It's so dreamy. It feels like they've reached this edge of the world, kind of like Hesperides style, to put another classical reference into this edge of world, this space between life and death, this dusk and dawn space that is so dreamlike, whereas he's stepping across the water, it's turning to sand. And Vetch does try to follow him during this sequence, but when Vetch leaves the boat, he falls into the water. So it's just this space that Ged can walk through because it's his fight. It's not Vetch's fight. And then they make their way back home. And that's the end of the book.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing that we end the book a little bit in Ged's position face, but like a lot in Vetch's. So
Mhm,
Ged can see sort of this like sea that is actually land and he can see where his shadow is, but like Vetch can't. So Vetch is just seeing the water and then at the end of it, like he's not sure what's happening. And I think it's like a real like we were talking about perspective, a lot of the time we're in third person, but we're kind of in Ged's head, like we kind of know
mhm,
where he is and what he wants. Occasionally we'll step out of it to stay in a place a little bit longer.
mhm,
We stay in that weird island by the rocks so we know what happens after the brother and sister that are marooned there go and the people who step through it later.
mhm,
But in this one, we really are in Fetch's perspective. We're sort of outside of it. But then when Shadow and Ged meet, we're back in Ged's perspective. So we could see the two of them coming together and basically, like, the light side and the dark
mhm.
side coming together to form one complete person.
It's like the end of the Dark Crystal when the Skeksis and the Mystics join together, becoming the Ur-Skeks.
Yeah, there's a lot of I think a very like 70s, like 60s, 70s kind of notion of like light and dark is in balance with each other that's
Mhm,
in this book. And it's really exemplified in Ged himself, in that accepting his parts of himself, that the pride that he cast, that he let, that consumed him, and then he cast off after his like spell. He's able to absorb that back into himself to become a full
mhm.
person.
Yeah, beautifully said.
Yeah, it's a coming of age book. It's beautiful, it's lovely, it's light.
Yeah, he also like this last scene, you don't get again, like with the dragon, you don't get this epic battle. That's not how he defeats it. He defeats it by just speaking its name. And obviously, as I said, that name is his name because the shadow is him and is part of him and is the and as Joe said, is the dark parts of him. Yeah, but this is like so it was so it was a cozy read. I would call this a cozy read.
There's a lot of space in the novel of people just living or
Mhm.
people just thinking, and it makes things really feel earned.
Yeah.
Whenever, like, it really makes the magic feel more concrete because
Mhm.
you actually spend a lot of time watching them recover from magic.
Mhm.
So whenever in the beginning they're like, you don't want to use too much magic because it really wears on you, and Ged's like, nah, I'm better than that. And then like,
Mhm.
you see him constantly getting exhausted by magic and like having to recover,
Mhm.
and then you see that makes him like a more patient person, and you're just like, ah, yeah. It makes sense. And then it also makes the older wizards, and it makes sense because they don't use a lot of magic, and then they're very thoughtful in the things they say and do, and you're
Mhm.
just like, yeah, when you have so much power but also there's so much potential for blowback, it makes you into this type of person.
Yeah, and it sets really important limits on magic that we don't often have, that we don't know exactly what those limits are as a rule. Like, if you use this much, then you have to recover for this many days. So it is soft in that sense, but it does make the magic really feel like this huge undertaking of power and then of energy that you're having to recover from later. So you feel the intensity of it. I think also a reason why this book feels so lovely to exist inside of, again, is just the prose. There were spaces in this book, there were quotes in this book that didn't need to exist in it at all. Like, if it wasn't there, I wouldn't notice that it was gone, but because those pieces of they almost felt really meditated, these little pieces of information about the world, about the philosophies surrounding magic and surrounding existing in this world, they were so beautifully placed and so beautifully written that I kind of was like, "I don't need there to be a plot if this is how this book is written." Like, it almost felt like reading poetry, and that was really quite lovely just to exist with those prose for a little bit, even just completely separating it from the story itself.
Yeah, this isn't a deep reading podcast, so we probably won't ever do like too fine a comb on any of
No.
those books. But a thing that I really enjoyed about the writing in this book is that there's actually very long sentences that
Mhm,
were full of explaining and imagery. So, like, anytime they would describe a place, you would get a paragraph long sentence and it would just really flow into each other. So,
mhm.
you really felt that you were moving through it. It really encouraged you. So, just like a tiny bit of craft that I noticed that I really appreciated.
Yeah, um, it was quite lovely. Should we recap about the dragon, or do you think that we have spoken enough about the dragon?
I think we can go brief, but like it's the dragon. This podcast is about dives into dragons, so we got to talk about the dragon.
Yeah, I mean, this was a really different version of a dragon than what we saw in our first book, where this dragon was this godlike creature that was really all powerful, and there was no hope of Ged being able to defeat it unless he had the one piece of information that he was able to use in this book, which was knowing its name. Otherwise, he would have never been able to even face it. And he defeated it, but he didn't harm it. This creature seems really eternal. It doesn't seem like anything can actually harm this older dragon, which was quite interesting.
And it had its own magic because the language it spoke was a magic of power. which I thought was very interesting. I
Mhm.
guess in Pern, I mean, first off, no dragon riding.
No.
Some of people have pets, but they're like not typical dragons. They're more like lizards. And the dragons in this book do like dragon things where they like raid and eat and fly
Mhm.
around. And I do think it sounds like they're pretty typically shaped dragons. You got your wings, you got your scales, you got your feet, like your clawed feet.
Three-forked tongue, which is a nice description.
Yeah, I really appreciated that one. So it is like still in shape a very traditional dragon, but it definitely leans into a a more magical and sort of the ancient dragon. And I'm hoping in this, the reason we're looking at this is we wanted to sort of see the dichotomy of dragon between kind of like companion, like what if a horse with wings versus the more ancient, unknowable dragon. And
Mhm.
I think between Pern and this, we've got sort of both dragons, where
Yeah.
one is like literally so old that it knows the world in a way that humanity has forgot. But then also you do have its dumb kids running around, which I thought was fun.
Yeah, is there anything else that you in my notes I wrote talk about the magic system, but I think we did talk about the dragons and talk about the pros. And then I finally wrote talk about Jed or Ged as a character, but I think we really did cover that. I really loved Ged as a character. I I loved his growth as a person. I loved his characterization. I loved his journey that he went on. This book was great. I think that if you haven't read Earthsea yet, you should read it.
It's so short,
It's
is one
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, it was easy to read. If you have COVID, it's a great book to read when you have COVID. I can speak from experience. But also if you're just like if you want a nice simple read that isn't too is just light and really lovely.
And it still it's got action scenes,
Mhm.
It
Yeah,
just doesn't have fight scenes, which I
no.
think is interesting.
But you don't miss them.
No, it's a great book.
I mean, he does fight with the younger dragons, I guess, but it's really
Yeah,
short.
for like
A
3
second.
sentences,
Yeah.
he turns into a dragon and fights them, and he's very cool, and then immediately is like, "Well, I can't do that ever again," which, fine, is the whole lesson of the book, is that he can't do that again. But it is very cool, and I do appreciate that, like, we got a little bit of it.
Yeah. Okay. So the moral of this episode, I think, is read Earthsea. Even though we just told you the entire plot, go read it.
There's 4 or 5 other books.
Yeah, I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the back cover of my copy. So at least 7, if not more. Oh wait, no, this one does include the first one. So at least 6,
I
if
should
not
say
more.
I have read the second book, it's been a minute, it's called The Tombs of Atua. It slaps. It follows the perspective of a girl who's, like, kind of being forced to be the priestess to this, like, tomb god who kinda sucks. Ged's in it, but, like, not for a while, and it's great. So,
Don't just read the first Earthsea, which is a Wizard of Earthsea. Read what's the second? The Tunes of Atuan.
yeah, no
And
dragons in it, though, so
oh
if
no.
you wanna read a book with dragons, you are going to have to read our book for next time, Guards by Terry Pratchett.
Yes. So next we are reading Guards by Terry Pratchett. I have read a few Terry Pratchett books and I have liked it. I do believe this is part of his Discworld series, which is technically part of a series, but each of his Discworld books really can stand alone. So we're still going to read it. Do you have some interesting things that you want to talk about with Terry Pratchett?
Yeah, I've never read more than a couple of chapters of a Terry Pratchett book, so I'm very excited to find out if I do not like Terry Pratchett or not. So stay
So we'll
tuned
find out
to figure
next
out.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, stay tuned to figure out if JoJo likes Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, that's all for today. Thank you for listening to us ramble on about wizards and dragons. This has been Canonical Nonsense, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.